Hi, friends, and good evening. Welcome to Taste of Science, an event series to feed your curiosity. And a warm welcome back to those of you who are returning viewers. My name is Ian Chapman, and I'm a city coordinator for Taste of Science San Antonio, right here in the state of Texas. Tonight's guest speaker has an interesting discussion about a problem affecting the world right now with serious implications for the future. So, audience, please join me in welcoming our guest, Shruthi Aravidan. Hi, Shruthi. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I'd like to remind our audience before we get started, please remember to leave your questions and comments in the chat. After Suchi's finished her discussion, we will revisit those questions and answer them directly. So Shruti, whenever you're ready, please let us know more about this global problem.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Today I'm going to be talking about combating antimicrobial resistance, the silent battle. So, a little bit about myself. I'm a third year at UCLA. I'm a public health major on the pre-dental track, and I've been doing research in the area of antimicrobial resistance since I was about 15 years old. It's something I'm really passionate about, and ever since I first learned of it, I've been dedicating a lot of time and energy towards research and raising awareness of this growing global crisis. So let's get into it. What are we going to be talking about today? So, first, I'm going to teach you a little bit about AMR or antimicrobial resistance. Then, I'm going to discuss what the big deal is about all this. And I'm going to share a little bit about the science and how it works and some action items we can take to prevent this problem from growing even bigger. So, first, the W's. Before that, I'd like to share a statistic. So, there were about 5 million deaths that were associated with bacterial antimicrobial resistance globally in 2019, according to The Lancet, which is a medical journal. And as you can see, this is a really jarring statistics and just one of the reasons why we need to pay more attention to AMR. Okay, so germs are microbes, which are very small organisms such as bacteria, fungi, parasites, and so on. While most of these germs are harmless and some are even beneficial to us, some of them can cause infections, and the harmful ones are called pathogens. Antimicrobials are drugs that kill many different types of infections by killing or slowing the growth of pathogens that cause the infection. And also, the words antibiotic and antimicrobial are often interchangeably used when discussing resistance. So, AMR occurs when bacteria, viruses, fungi, or parasites change over time and they no longer respond to the medications that are used to kill them, which makes these infections even harder to treat and increase the risk of disease spread. As a result of drug resistance, antibiotics and other antimicrobial medications become ineffective and again propagates the spread of disease. AMR is a global health threat, and the World Health Organization has declared AMR as one of the top 10 global health public health crises that is facing humanity today. The misuse and overuse of antimicrobials are the main drivers in the development of drug resistant pathogens. So, what accelerates this emergence and spread? While AMR can occur naturally over time through genetic changes, antimicrobial resistant organisms are found in people, animals, food, plants, the environment, and in water, soil, and air. They can spread between these sources. Again, the main drivers of this resistance are the misuse and overuse of antimicrobials, but the lack of access to clean water, sanitation, hygiene, and proper healthcare system infrastructure can also be contributors. So, what is the big deal? The alarmingly rapid global spread of multi drug resistant bacteria, also called superbugs such as MRSA, that cause infections are becoming increasingly untreatable with the existing antimicrobial medicines. Furthermore, the production of new drugs is significantly low. In 2019, the World Health Organization identified only 32 antibiotics in clinical development that addressed the WHO's list of priority pathogens. But of these, only six were classified as innovative. What this means is that although there are 32, which is already a low number, of these, only six have potential to help this issue, and we're not sure yet if they're going to work. So, antibiotic shortages are affecting countries and health systems all around the world. For common bacterial infections like UTIs, sepsis, STIs, and so on, the high rates of resistance against antibiotics used to treat these infections have been observed. This is yet another sign that we are running out of effective antibiotics. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritties of how AMR works. So personally, what the antibiotic resistance research I focus on are projects such as evaluating the effectiveness of alternatives that are commonly used as antibiotics. I've also worked on destroying bacterial biofilms, which are basically large sheets of bacteria. They get stronger and even harder to destroy when they grow together because they form this kind of film on top, and they have enhanced communication when they're within the biofilm, and this again just makes it really hard to kill them with normal antibiotics. And I've also studied how bacterial biofilms can be combated in a clinical setting, specifically in dental wastewater chair pipelines. So while I've sort of focused my research on these three things, this area is extremely vast. You can look at it from a climate perspective, an agricultural perspective, an environmental perspective, and so on. And there's no way for one single scientist to be able to focus on all these areas and find solutions to antimicrobial resistance, which is another reason we need to bring more awareness to this issue and be able to fund more research and develop more tools for us to deal with it. So there's basically three fundamental mechanisms of antimicrobial resistance. The first one is enzymatic degradation of antibacterial drugs. What this basically means is that the drugs are not being processed as they should be by the pathogens in order for them to be killed, and they're developing these sort of guards against this medication that increases resistance. There can also be an alteration of the bacterial proteins that are antimicrobial targets. So when the structure or chemical composition of something of these proteins changes, the drugs that are sort of developed to target these proteins are not as effective anymore. And what this leads to is just more spread of infection and an inability to treat the disease. And lastly, there can also be membrane permeability changes to these antibiotics. What this means is that the cell membrane of some of these pathogens, like the bacteria, can basically become less susceptible to these drugs through certain changes. And the drugs, again, that are made to attack these bacteria in a specific way are not going to be effective anymore because of these changes. So antibiotic resistance occurs when the bacteria evolve to evade the effects of the antibiotics through multiple different mechanisms. And you can see some of these in this infographic put out by the CDC. There are basically three different types of mobile genetic elements: a plasmid, a transposon, and a phage. So as you can see in this picture below, you can kind of see how these mobile genetic elements work to spread different pieces of the antimicrobial resistance gene. So this is a bacteriophage that can basically introduce the DNA of an antibiotic resistant bacteria to a bacteria that was previously non-resistant. This is just one of the ways in which antibiotic resistance can spread. Okay. So in the US, there are more than 2.8 million antimicrobial resistant infections that occur each year. Of these, more than 35,000 people die, according to the CDC's 2019 Antibiotic Resistance Threat Report. Furthermore, there's new evidence that suggests that surges in COVID-19 related hospital admissions are associated with an increase in antibiotic resistant infections, including things like MRSA, which is methicillin resistant Staph aureus, and vancomycin resistant Enterococcus, according to the Lancet, which again is a medical journal. So I think this is really interesting to look at because I started my antibiotic or antimicrobial resistant research before COVID was even a thing. And so it's been kind of interesting to see how the field is developing to sort of work with the changes that COVID-19 has brought forward. Okay, so the actions. So what do we do now? All medical and dental professionals need to be informed of the proper antibiotic resistance protocol. They need to make sure that the patients have the right information on antibiotics, and kind of tying into that, the patients should take care to follow the proper course of antibiotics that they're being prescribed. Because again, the misuse or overuse of antibiotics is one of the biggest drivers of this antibiotic resistance. Also, there needs to be more care that needs to be taken to prevent hospital-acquired infections, also called nosocomial infections, because without proper sanitation or protocols in place and improper healthcare structures, this can be really detrimental in spreading this antibiotic resistance even further than it already has. These are some of the resources for my presentation, and thank you so much.
That was great, Shruthi. Thank you for sharing your work with us. Now, before we get to the comments, I did have a quick question of my own. In climate change discussions, we often hear CO2 reductions linked to specific target deadlines. Are there any similar deadlines for getting AMR under control?
So far, the US has done a few specific things over the past 10 or so years to combat this, but no significantly impactful actions have been taken. But there is more and more of a push to take some action and form committees to prevent antimicrobial resistance from growing even more, especially if we want to meet the UN Sustainable Developmental Goals. So, kind of yes and no. I do think there needs to be a lot more work that has to take place pretty soon in order for us to fight this issue. But yeah.
All right. Okay, so before we get to our comments, I do want to let the viewers know if you'd like to engage more with Taste of Science San Antonio, you can find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Taste of Science SA, or on our website, tasteofscience.org/San Antonio. Okay, now let's go over to the comments, and we have a question from Shamika. Okay, Shamika asks, is there any tips for school systems to assist in these actions?
I think a really great initiative that can take place is just education and making sure people know that you should follow the proper prescription. But also, I've noticed that there's been an increase in the number of nonprofits that work to support this goal. So maybe through mobilizing your local community, there can be a lot more awareness that's brought to this issue.
Okay. We have another question from Kellen. And Kellen asks, who are the leading organizations doing research to fight against this issue?
So I have noticed a surge in a lot of university labs that are doing research on this. For example, at UCLA, I know a few labs that do it, but the World Health Organization, CDC, NIH, these are all really great places where research is taking place, and they're bringing more and more awareness to these issues through infographics and just putting out some of the threat reports like the one I mentioned in my presentation. But I do think that there needs to be more of an initiative to make this more accessible to the public so that they know that it's an increasingly like growing issue that needs to be combated.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question from Jonathan who asks, is there a population that's particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, naturally immunocompromised patients are going to be more vulnerable, but also in countries that don't have proper healthcare infrastructure, this can also be a growing issue. While antimicrobial resistance is something that affects all countries globally, it is something that is definitely more prevalent where there isn't proper sanitation available or proper healthcare systems that are able to fight against this.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually. We have a question from Taste of Science. What is the impact of COVID pandemic on antimicrobial resistance?
So I don't know the specific science on how it works, and there's still a lot of research that needs to be done just because it's such a novel area and something that we're actively dealing with. But there has been some speculation that COVID could perhaps disrupt your gut microbiota, which can also, if you kind of lose the good bacteria, it makes the antibiotic resistance bacteria perhaps like surge in numbers. So there's more research that needs to be done in this area, but there have been cases, like I mentioned in my presentation, where more hospitalizations, you're just kind of exposing yourself to this environment where antimicrobial resistance can be more present. So that could be one way the pandemic has affected it.
Okay. We have a question from Sara who asks, what do you or the barriers to making this what are the barriers making this information more available for the public?
I think that these larger health organizations need to do a better job at just education, because when they put out their reports, they're very highly statistical and fact or information dense. So I think there needs to be a better way to kind of communicate this science to the public, which is why I love doing talks like this, because I'm able to share some of my research and bring awareness to something I'm really passionate about.
All right, thank you. Richard has a question, and he asks, for small children, is it better to wash their hands versus using hand sanitizer daily?
So I don't know the specific answer to this question, but just based on my background knowledge, I would say if you have the opportunity to wash your hands, it's much better than using hand sanitizer, but it would be better to use hand sanitizer if you don't have access to washing your hands.
Okay, fair enough. I do have we have another question from Shanika. It's kind of like in a similar field. Is the use of hand sanitizers an issue?
I did read something like 3 or 4 years ago relating to this. I don't know how concrete the research is, but if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn or something, I could probably find the answer and tell you more about it.
All right, great. We'll share your LinkedIn information a little bit later before we wrap up. I did have another personal question. Being that you are kind of very aware of this field, are you optimistic about the direction that the world is going in with respect to AMR?
I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic. I do think that the strides that are taken in research are significant, but also there needs to be a lot more that's done specifically in the pharmaceutical side in developing more of these drugs that are going to be effective for these rapidly evolving pathogens, especially against superbugs. And I personally think that if we don't take action right now, this could become a really, really big public health crisis. I've also seen in some places that people say that this could become the next pandemic. So we need to be really careful about the steps we're taking right now to prevent that from happening.
All right. Well, thank you for all of your information and insight. Did you have any? That was the last question from our comments. Do you have any final thoughts or comments for our audience before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm just really grateful to have this opportunity to share a little bit about this and bring more awareness. So thank you so much for joining.
All right, and thank you for presenting for us. I also want to thank the audience for joining us this evening, and for the Taste of Science Centennial team for helping put this webinar together. Everyone, thank you, be well, and good night.